Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I am honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Professor Noah Giansiracusa and Professor Karen Saxe. Thank you for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of nearly 400 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Noah Giansiracusa is an associate professor of mathematics at Bentley University and a visiting scholar at Harvard with a PhD in algebraic geometry from Brown University. He has appeared on CNN and BBC Radio and has written for The Washington Post, Scientific American, Time Magazine, Wired, The Boston Globe, and others. Noah's latest book, tonight's topic, Robin Hood Math, Take Control of the Algorithms That Run Your Life, explores how people of all backgrounds can use math to help navigate life and take back control in a world dominated by algorithms. He is also co-host of the AI in Academia podcast. Joining him is Karen Saxe. She is a Senior Vice President of Government Relations for the American Mathematical Society. She represents the Society's 30,000 members, ensuring that legislation and policies support mathematics research, mathematicians, and students. She is Professor Emerita at Macalester College, where she served as chair of the Department of Mathematics, Statistics, and Computer Science. And now let's offer a warm fan welcome to both Noah and Karen.
Let me just thank Lonnie. This is my first time doing a fan event, and it's already been a wonderful experience getting ready for this and preparing. And I can say Karen and I are very excited to be here.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Thanks all of you for joining us, and also thanks to Lonnie and Fan for hosting us. So Noah, it's so great to see you and again, and to have you as a friend. I get to call you a friend and a co-conspirator, working to show that math and quantitative thinking more generally are used in so many ways that affect everyone's lives. And where I think you're you're genius in many ways, notably genius is in your ability to show that the ways that math affects people's lives are more easily understandable than a lot of people think. And that's one thing I really want to talk about a lot tonight. And I think to all the viewers, it'll become apparent over the next hour how great Noah is at this. And one thing that I'm not going to stop on now, but I think your efforts are particularly important right now with science and education being viewed with skepticism and indeed under attack in our country. And we might come back to that. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a technical question, not exactly technical, but a like math nerd question, and then I'll sort of step back from that. So mathematicians are visual thinkers, at least I am, and most mathematicians I know are visual thinkers. On my first reading of your book, I was immediately struck by the fact that you have no charts, no formulas, and so on. Now, to be fair, you do put in print Bayes' formula about conditional probabilities, and you might even have it twice, but I think that's the only formula. And you don't have any like histograms or anything like that. And you do explain what a histogram is. And I think I'd be so tempted to, put a picture of one, which would of course then bias the reader as to what one should look like. So I imagine the choice not to put images or formulas was deliberate. And could you talk about that choice a little bit?
Yeah, so first, let me just thank you for the warm introduction. I want to correct one detail, which is you were tossing around the word genius. And I just want to say, and not to be modest, but I really think we should be careful, especially in math, to kind of avoid using this word.
Yes.
And part of what I want to show in this book is that you really don't have to be a genius to do math, to think math, to use math, and not to be conspiratorial. But I think part of what's happening, there's certainly a historical kind of mythology around genius and math and physics and these things. But I think what's happening, this book is focusing more on algorithms. And I think a lot of the tech companies lean into that by kind of giving this aura that, only the most genius people can understand our algorithms and our AI and, all these apps and what we're doing. So you just have to trust us. And, you won't understand how a chatbot works or how TikTok algorithm works because our genius engineers are the only ones. So part of why I'm not just being modest, I really think we can understand their stuff. We don't have to know the 10,000 lines of code or whatever they need, but I think we can understand the basics of their algorithms, and I think we should, and I think it helps us. So that's part of what I want to mention on that. The other
Yeah,
part is my
yeah.
experience in math. I don't know if you've had this, is every single person I've been in math felt like a genius compared to me. I mean, everyone seems so much smarter than me. And it
Mhm.
really kind of made me think like I'm just not good enough to be a mathematician. And yet somehow, I made it. And many of us do make it, probably feeling that way. And I think it's just when people know a lot about something that you don't yet know about, they do feel like a genius. But once you understand it, it can become very simple. So I think a lot of people, it's kind of fun talking about this book, and we'll get more into it. But part of what's fun is people have this visceral reaction usually to math of, oh, I used to love it and then I had this bad experience, or, oh, I hate math. I don't, it triggers emotions. And I think part of that is just, it often feels very confusing and very hard. And it does feel like one would have to be a genius to do math. And I do want to try to dispel that. So let me try to leverage that, which is not your question, into your actual question. What
But thank
happened
you
is,
for saying that. Yeah, thank you
yeah,
for saying all
no
that.
problem. I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think it's helpful. Us, I can't help resisting mentioning there. I can't remember her name right now, but an journalist who writes a lot for The Atlantic recently published a book that's about genius and the whole history of it from like Renaissance times and earlier, leading up to like Elon Musk and things. And I haven't read it yet, but I heard some podcasts about it. It really seemed fascinating. So I'm going to read it, and I encourage others. Okay, let me finally answer your first question. So what happened is I have two little kids. I have a 30-ish minute commute. Once I'm at the office, meetings, teaching, I get distracted. I'm just finding I don't have a lot of time to sit down and read a book, like physically read a book. And when I do, I'm reading things for my teaching, things for my research. I just found that lately, the last few years, most of my not directly work reading, and even a lot of my work reading, happens when I'm walking the dog, when I'm going for a run with the kid in the stroller. It's happening more and more on audio. And it's funny because I was never much of an audio learner. I was much more visual. So I had kind of the same reaction as you, like math without pictures, that doesn't make sense. But I've just gotten into reading books through the audio format, and it's really resonated with me. So then when I decided to write a book, I just couldn't imagine it not being in audio format. Like it just seemed like what a lost opportunity. All the people that could be walking their dogs are not going to be reading my book, and I wanted to make it accessible to them. But I also thought this kind of ties back to what we were mentioning earlier with the kind of atmosphere around math being harder than it is. I thought, you know what? This will be a good challenge. If I can make a whole book about math understandable without any visuals or formulas, just words and stories, then that's kind of a good sign that I've gotten to the level that I'm hoping to get to. Because this is not a textbook. This is stories. And
Yeah. Oh,
words are
that's
stories.
great. The audible. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that because I think about pictures, and there's so many math things we look at that is, heavily dominated by sort of visual things. And your whole thing about genius and or not genius. I actually have some questions later about that if we get there.
All right.
So I wanted to talk about like some specific topics in the book. So I really enjoyed the section on Romer's rule of thumb recipe for risk, I think it's called.
Mhm.
And you point out that we usually think about risk of what we're about to do, but we don't think about the risk associated with something we don't do.
Mhm.
With maybe one really notable exception in medical treatment. So like if a doctor suggests a medical treatment or a test and you think, oh, I don't really want to do that, you might consider it then. But for lower bar decisions like should I go to the gym? And these will kind of ramp up in terms of low bar. Should I go to the gym? Should I ask that person to go out with me or do something with me? Should I buy a new car? Should I take a new job? Should we have a child? These kind of decisions. Do you have examples of how writing this chapter on managing risk changed how you think about choices, and then maybe some pointers for other people, to help to sort of guide people to make, what can they do in their own life to think that through, to think that.
Yeah, great question. So I would say the first thing is I was just trying to come up with topics. So the overall arching theme of the book, Robin Hood Math, is that a lot of people in quantitative fields are using math to great advantage. And everyone else who's not with the quantitative math, training is not able to use these tools. And I believe this is creating an inequality that's mostly economic, but it's even more than that. It's like a social kind of class thing, right? That these tech prodigies and math quants and Wall Street, that somehow they live in this rarefied world where everything they do and say is smart because it's data driven and numbers and mathy, and everyone else just has to sort of trust them, and we're kind of left behind. So the big picture of the book, it is about algorithms and fighting back, but it's broader. It's really that math is somehow used by a lot of elites, and I want to try to bring that and give that math, take it from the rich and give it to the rest of us. So that's the Robin Hood aspect. And so I was thinking, what are some topics? What would I like to discuss were examples of people using math? So investing is an obvious one. A lot of people on Wall Street have very quantitative financial background, mathy backgrounds. And there's a lot of, not everyone's going to become a quantitative trader by reading one book or even a bunch, but I think a lot of us could benefit by thinking about some basic concepts like what diversification really means, et cetera. So finance seemed like an obvious chapter, but another one is insurance. I've had some friends in college that went on to become actuaries, and it's a whole profession of people who are like professional statisticians whose job is to price risk and to figure out, how much you should pay to avoid certain kind of catastrophes and damages and harms. And it's a whole industry, and it's amazing. And I just thought this is another example of insurance companies tend to be fairly profitable. There's a whole, they make a lot of money, and actuaries are not like NBA stars, but they do well by using math. And I thought, okay, maybe we can't use all their formulas and stuff, but is there some simple ideas or concepts we can get from what actuaries are doing that we could apply in our own life? So that's the long-winded answer to say, I decided I have to write a chapter about risk and how insurance people manage it and what we can do with a little bit of math, but not going as far. And the first thing I realized, and I'm not embarrassed to say this, is I've used the word risk for many years of my life. I've heard people like Nate Silver talk about it. When I sit down and started to type, the first word in this chapter, I realized I don't know what risk is. So I had to think, what really is it? And the best I could come up with, it's hard to find a definition, is something like the probability of an event with a negative impact. But it's really a probability. It's a statistical thing. If I drive my car, there's a risk I could be in a car accident. If I eat too much red meat, there's a risk of heart disease. So risk is always a probability of a negative situation or an event occurring. And that already helps you realize, like, okay, we are talking about probabilities. There is a language of probabilities, of quantifying them and working with them. And it kind of forces you, you don't have to do math, but I think oftentimes setting the table as though you were going to do math is actually already helpful. So just telling myself, risk is not this like fuzzy, nebulous thing. It is a probability. And it could be very hard to pin down that probability. I know when I drive, there's a probability of an accident. And if I drink alcohol first, that probability increases. I don't know how much, but it's already, you notice I haven't done any math. And yet I'm already feeling like, oh, okay, there's always some chance of negative thing. And my actions impact that chance in different directions. To me, it just feels clarifying already. So to zoom in on some examples that you're asking about, like where it really elucidates things. One is what you're saying, that we tend to think of risks of our actions, and we often overlook that they're risks of our inactions. So this is very famous with vaccine hesitancy, right?
Yeah.
A new vaccine comes out. We were all around a few years ago when this happened, and you hear about some side effects and you get worried. Oh, I don't want to take it. It's not safe. There's side effects. Well, what about the side effect of not a side effect, but what about the risk of not getting vaccinated? There is a risk. There is a risk that you will get the disease you're trying to avoid. There's a risk that that disease will have, very serious or permanent things. So just moving into this probabilistic perspective, even if you're never using a formula or numbers, is very helpful, because it's so easy to say like, oh, I can't help going there. The COVID vaccine doesn't work because you still get COVID when you have the vaccine. And it doesn't prevent long COVID and all these things.
Yeah.
That's not probabilistic thinking. You always have a probability of getting COVID, and the vaccine does reduce that probability, and it may increase the risk of some other side effect. But if you look at the numbers or even just use your instinct, you can kind of see how those risks are weighing against each other. And a more recent example, this one really struck me because I hadn't thought about it. I was talking to someone about Ozempic and these GLP-1, these weight loss drugs, and similar conversation. Oh, they seem very popular, but they haven't been tested for, like a 20-year duration. So how do I know they don't have long-term side effects? It doesn't seem safe. I'm going to wait. And I was all ready to say, like, that's very smart. There's that mathematical thinking. And then I thought, wait a minute. We know there's many known side effects of obesity, at the individual level, but even at the population level, our whole healthcare system has to face the consequences of a lot of these issues. So suddenly it just changed the way I was thinking about it. So this is, I guess, my answer to your question was just even thinking of these obesity drugs. We're not asking, are they fully safe or do they have negative side effects? Do they have risks? What we need to ask is, what are the risks of taking them versus what are the risks of not taking them? And I think that's a fascinating conversation. I'm not qualified to answer. I'm not a researcher in that field, but just asking that question gets us so much closer to being able to have a meaningful conversation. And I hadn't thought about that until I worked on this chapter.
Yeah, I found that really interesting to read. And in answering that, you mentioned, or you said something, I can't exactly remember what you said about, like, people aren't doing math, or people think they're not doing math. And actually, in my view, and I imagine you would agree, everybody does math all the time. That, like, people say, I don't do math, I can't do math. And that's just a flat out lie. And I think one of the, the more mathematical topics that you explain so well in the book is the idea of a weighted index. And I thought, like, for everybody listening, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that and sort of first announce to everybody that you use weighted indices all the time. And last night I was baking cookies and I started, thinking about the recipe, and I couldn't remember, am I supposed to put 2¼ cups of flour or 2½ cups? And, flour is the one of the things in my list of index. So, like, there's flour, sugar, whatever, butter, eggs, those are the things in the index, and then the amount are the weights. So now I'm doing a weighted index, right? 2¼ cups of flours, 2 eggs. That's my weighted index. So you have several examples in the book, and a weighted index I know sounds pretty mathy to a lot of people and perhaps turns people off, but it's a really rich mathematical notion, and you give a ton of examples in the book about choosing, or the college rankings, I guess, the making investments that you just talked about, politics and voting, I think engaging with social media. I can't quite remember how that thing, but
I can help fill you in, no worries.
yeah, and then, like, choosing fantasy sports teams, there's so many things. So maybe you could, like, recap a little bit of that. That would be
absolutely.
wonderful to
Yeah, so
hear about.
My pleasure. So the big picture, so actually let me zoom out first because I can't resist, is I think a lot of people, and this goes back to that genius thing that I can't, it's stuck in my head now, but I think a lot of people think the most useful math is the most complicated math. Imagine some huge formula, some really complicated thing. That's real math, and that's the powerful stuff. And if I'm just doing fractions, that's silly little school math, that's not so deep. And maybe I felt that way for many years. I'm not going to say that's a naive perspective because I've had that for many years. But what I've come to in my mature stage of life now is that it's kind of the opposite, that the simplest math is the most profound, it's the most universal, the most ubiquitous, and I would say the most useful. And when you said, like, people say they don't do math, they really are, I think that's kind of what you're hitting at, is that some of the math some of what people do doesn't feel like math because it's so ubiquitous. Like the number 0 was an invention that took how many thousands of years of civilization to come up with. To us, it feels like, oh, that's such a simple thing, 0. Like, I'm not a mathematician because I can count with 0, but that was a profound concept. So profound that it feels banal now. And I think this often happens in math, that the simplest things are the most profound. They're the most far-reaching. So one of the things that surprised me, like even in the last couple of years when I was working on this book, is, as I said, the whole idea was just each chapter would be its own little topic of an example of taking math from the rich and bringing it to ordinary people. I wasn't thinking, like, how the mathematics itself would flow and develop, that there'd be any kind of continuity. I just thought, like, oh, insurance is one, Wall Street's one, social media is one. So that's how I was coming with topics. And yet the vast majority, I don't know, like 80% of the chapters, the math ends up being around the same idea that you mentioned, this weighted sum or weighted index. So let me uh, talk about what that is. I'll start with social media, but then I'll branch into the others because it's amazing it's the same story. Everyone has probably heard that social media algorithms are driven by engagement, right? Whatever posts get the most engagement, they go viral, they go to the top of your feed. But here's the thing. A like is a form of engagement. A comment is a form of engagement. A reshare is a form of engagement. Depending on the platform, there could be heart emojis, there could be this and that. There's lots of different things, but you get the idea. There's lots of different kinds of engagement. So what does the most engagement mean? I could post a picture, Karen, that gets 20 likes and one comment. You could post one that gets 5 likes and 10 comments. Someone, lots of different ways of those numbers adding up. What does it the most mean? Well, there is no answer. There's no such thing. When you have apples and oranges and bananas, you can't add up the 3 different things. So there's this amazingly simple idea of what's called a weighted sum or weighted index. You just assign a value or a weight to each of those things. Let's say a like is worth 1 point and a comment's worth 20 points and a reshare is worth 40 points. So those are weights. Then you can count up the total amount of engagement. Your post got, I can count how many likes and comments and shares. And now I just add up the number of points that it's earning. So I've quantified engagement. And now I can add up my post's total engagement. I can compare these. And basically, in a nutshell, what all the algorithms, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, everything you can imagine, X, they all have basically the same architecture for their algorithm, which is they use some fancy AI to try to predict how many engagement points each post will have and show each user the post with the highest number of engagement points first. This needs AI because, something comes up, some political story or a picture of a puppy, I'm likely to engage with it differently than you are, Karen, and then everyone else. So the algorithm is trying to guess how many likes and comments and things it'll get from me and from you and from everyone else. So what we see is personalized because we engage in different ways. But that's the basic story is these algorithms are not these, crazy mind reading machines like TikTok says. They have some fancy AI, but at the end of the day, all they're trying to do is guess how many engagement points each post is going to earn from you. And then they rank their posts based on that. That's not that complicated, or to lean back to our opening discussion, you don't have to be a genius to get that. And yet I never hear people explain it that simply. Somehow it's just never offered to us. And I think the problem is the tech companies don't necessarily want to admit that it's that simple. A lot of the tech journalists probably don't know. They don't feel like they have enough math background or quantitative background to say, like, all you guys are doing is counting engagement points. Just say that. So they kind of respect the tech companies and write articles that make it seem like it's all this magic. So there's a little bit of the emperor's new clothes here. Like it's hard to just say, like, all you're doing is giving these points and trying to guess how many points each person's going to give a post. Okay, so that's social media and a little rant about that. But the interesting thing is this happens everywhere, exactly as you're saying, Karen. So think of colleges. One of the other books that we saw promoted on the opening slide was the Dream School about getting into your dream college, the author of this other book about the higher education system, at least in the US, I think. So in the US, but they have these elsewhere in the world as well, we all hear about the US News rankings, right? So-and-so school is 25 in US News, and the next year it drops down to 50, and then it's up to 20. So US News is hugely influential. What is it? What does it mean? Like, if your school is 27th in the nation in US News? Well, it turns out US News collects a bunch of variables or indices that they think are important. Could be graduation rate, retention rate, first year retention rate. They used to use more things like SAT scores, but they've moved away from that. They have things like faculty salary, spending per student, class size per student, all these different factors. But same thing, how do you measure? Like, I don't know, Columbia might be number 1 in class size, Harvard might be number 1 in research spending, Princeton might be number 1 in faculty salary. I'm just making these things up, I have no idea. So what's the best school? Well, the real answer is there is none. That's not a well-defined thing. That's like a made-up arbitrary thing. But people don't like admitting that when you use data and numbers, that at the end of the day, you're producing some made-up subjective thing. Like people want to think that data implies rigor and impartiality and objective, sorry. So what they do is they assign weights, just like the engagement points, 1 point for a like, 20 points for a comment, etc. They can assign points for graduation rate, points for employment statistics, weights for all the other factors we talked about, for faculty salaries. They can assign weights. And now once you have weights, it's the same story. You can add up the total score of each university and say which one comes on top. But it's the same kind of arbitrariness. To me, maybe employment, percentage of students employed within 9 months of graduation, whatever they measure, maybe that's the most important thing. But to someone else, that might be the least important thing. But US News has just decided weights that are affixed to all of these different indices, and that's the world that we live in. So this is just to say weights, these weighted indices or weighted sums, they show up everywhere. I don't want to spend too many times on it, but I'll just say like FICO scores, your credit score is also a weighted sum. Even things like the Dow Jones and NASDAQ, all these financial indices, these weighted sums or weighted indices. They're everywhere. And what I learned from this by not being an expert, I didn't go into writing this book as like an expert in higher ed and an expert in the Dow Jones and all these things. What I learned is these weighted sums are everywhere. And in every case, the weights are extremely important. You're going to have a totally different social media platform if they cranked up likes and cranked up the weight on likes and cranked down the weights on comments. Right? Comments are often very divisive. So if you put a high weight on comments, you're going to get a lot of arguments online. So these weights shape our social media. The weights shape our college rankings. A few years ago, there's this huge scandal where in 1 year, a whole bunch of schools went way up and way down in US News, and everyone's trying to figure out what's going on. It turned out all that happened was US News adjusted their weights. That's it. No real data change, no anything substantive change. They just changed their weights. So I've come around to realizing my big epiphany here is weighted sums are everywhere. We tend not to be aware and recognize it. And the weights matter tremendously. So in some cases, you have a chance to influence them. Like in the book, I talk about how you can make your own weighted sum for college rankings and other things. In some cases, you can't. Like FICO scores, I can't make my own credit ranking system and say, look, in my system, I have great credit. I just have to use FICO. But recognizing that it's a weighted sum and learning what the weights are can help you kind of play this numbers game. So
Yeah.
I would say weighted sums turn a lot of life into a numbers game, but they don't really tell us the rules of this number game. And I think basic math, just addition, multiplication, can help you play the game a lot better.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like if I'm thinking about what's my favorite, sports team or something. Well, like if I think about football, which I happen to love, and I know I probably shouldn't announce that out loud, but what do I care about? Like a really exciting offense, or it sort of depends. Like what do you? It's not just win-loss record, but yeah, I think one thing that's really wonderful about being a mathmatician, I think the beauty of math is that there's a few very good ideas that can just do so much for you in life. So to kind of change gears a little bit, well, you mentioned AI and we talking about social media, and I think a lot about the harm that social media can do. And then on the sort of flip side, and AI, the harm that AI more generally can do and the sort of good it can do. So, well, let me start by telling you that I learned a new word reading your book. And do you want to guess what it is?
I'm afraid to guess now.
Okay. And I'm good. If I say it incorrectly, I should have asked AI to pronounce it for me, but
I do have a guess. Numerification?
No, Pigouvian.
Oh, Pigouvian. Okay.
Is that how you say it?
I assume so.
Yeah. Okay. So there's an economist, Pigou, I guess, and probably everybody listening knows this already. So I'll be embarrassed, but I didn't know about this. So due to the work that I do in Washington, D.C., I think about policy options a lot for helping, us as a society move forward with technology developments. And right now I'm sort of thinking about AI. So, there's incentives for developing AI for good. And then there's sort of how can we regulate things? And you have a chapter called Standing Up to the Tech Titans. And you mentioned a possible ad tax on AI companies that could help address job loss due to AI doing tasks that people used to do. But do you think that, so first, maybe you should say what a Pigouvian tax is, and to remind me, and maybe some other people won't know what it is, but also explain your idea for a progressive ad tax that might help with regulation efforts. Like, what would this look like?
Yeah,
That's
great.
something you want to talk about?
I would love to, because I've done a few interviews around the book and no one has touched that yet. So I'm glad to finally get to it. I
Okay.
found a sufficiently wonky policy person to go there.
Okay, well,
So
yeah.
the context in the book is that I really tried to make every chapter something an ordinary individual can read and learn and use in their everyday life. Like, every single chapter is, here's some math that you can use, something you can do, a formula you can apply, an idea, a concept. But I just couldn't, with a clean conscience, end the book without kind of addressing the fact that that only goes so far. We're not going to fix the world by just educating people in math and now we can all take care of ourselves and use formulas and everything's happy. There are things where we need collective action, where we need society, where we need government. And so I don't want to kind of espouse a kind of libertarian utopian idea that, like, okay, with math, we're fine. I do think we need more. I think the math helps us. I think we're kind of bullied around intellectually without this kind of mathematics to buttress our understanding of the world. But again, it's not enough. So I thought, okay, I don't want to leave readers hanging thinking like, oh, you're fine now, go out, do good in the world, use your math. But I also don't want to say like, all right, that's not going to get you far enough. We're done. Now let's just leave math. So I realized, you know what? There are some policy proposals that I really personally like that I think mathematics can very much clarify what's going on. And so that last chapter is trying to talk about some examples where there are things we can do in the policy world, in the regulatory framework, that are not overtly mathematical. And yet I think thinking in the mathematical lens can really clarify them and maybe help sell the public on them more, and even help policymakers see like, oh yeah, that's like an obvious thing we should do. So I was trying to think of what to put into that. And somehow, kind of randomly, I developed this friendship with this economist, Paul Romer. He's the one actually who came up with that risk management formula that you alluded to, and I did not want to get to directly because it actually does take some math and formulas, but not something I want to talk about at this late in the day.
Right.
But so Paul Romer's been very, very supportive and friendly, and he won the Nobel Prize in economics several years ago. So I was kind of intimidated getting to know him and talk to him, and kind of, I'm not an economist, so I didn't know what Pigouvian was either. As I said, I didn't even know what the Dow Jones Industrial, like, I've heard this word, I never knew that there's a formula and how it's computed. So like, zero knowledge going in. But I think it's great. I think it's really nice to have an open mind and to kind of take down this idea that, oh, I only know my lane and discipline, so what right do I have thinking and talking about other things? I think we just all need to like do a better job of talking to each other and saying, like, reaching out, like, this is what I'm trying to do in the book, and say, don't look at me like a mathy person. Look at me as someone who's trying to help you embrace math as well, right? Like, I'm reaching out to you. I'm not pushing you away and say, let me do the math. And Romer was very much this way with economics. He was helping teach me a lot of economics that I thought was fascinating, some of which ended up in the book, and others that ended up in some projects I'm working on. So it's been really fun. So he had a op-ed in the New York Times in 2018, I think, where he has this interesting story. His Nobel Prize was for, basically what happened was, economists knew for many, many years that technology is increasing our growth, right? Our economy is bigger now than it was 100 years ago. But if you looked at the actual economic theory and literally the formulas and equations of like macroeconomics, they said like, oh, each year we're getting closer to depleting our finite resources. So eventually growth is going to flatten out and go down. So for many years, it's this weird thing where the actual math that people are using in economics said growth is stagnating, going to drop. And the reality is growth is growing and growing. And everyone knew the common sense answer, of course, because of technology. But nobody knew how to get technology into the macroeconomic equations. So that's what he got his Nobel Prize for. So he was this huge, like, rock star hero in Silicon Valley because basically his theory is explaining why Silicon Valley is doing so well and why it's so important. That ideas, that technology, they are the thing that keeps continual growth in our economy. But so he was like the hero of Silicon Valley for many years. But then he started to see a lot of the problems with social media and other things, as many of us did. So he penned this op-ed in New York Times, I think again, 2018, where he kind of turned against big tech in a way by proposing this tax that's targeted at big tech. And the idea is, let me zoom out. So what's a Pigouvian tax? There's a lot of proposals and discussion now. I'm sure you've seen this, Karen. I'm sure our audience has heard about this of, oh, we should ban TikTok because China could manipulate us. Social media is really dangerous. We should ban this. We should prevent this. And it's this very like black and white, ban things. Oh, that's going to make things worse. Let's not ban it. It doesn't get passed. So no regulation gets passed, or if it does, it's too extreme, and then Supreme Court throws it down. And there's not a lot of nuance in the levers that we're pulling in the regulatory sense. Mm-hmm. So what the idea with the Pigouvian tax is to come up with a tax that imposes a financial disincentive for the behavior you're trying to get rid of. So for instance, polluting the environment is clearly a bad thing, but you can't exactly say, oh, we're going to ban pollution, right? Pollution is always going to happen. We just want to make it less profitable, right? Make companies think like, oh, I could, pollute and emit a lot of carbon emissions, but that's going to be costly, so I'm better off coming up with a green energy sustainable way. So the most famous example of a Pigouvian tax is the carbon tax, where you just tax carbon emissions. So yes, you can still emit carbon, but you have to pay for it. And therefore, companies who can find ways of producing and doing whatever they're doing without the carbon emissions or with less carbon emissions will be more profitable than the ones that make more emissions. So it's a pretty straightforward idea. Unfortunately, it has the word tax in its name, so it's very hard to get it passed. But anyway, that's the famous example. So what Paul Romer suggested is a Pigouvian tax. So and either if that word is fancy and new, just think things like a carbon tax, but aimed at targeted advertising. So there's been a lot of research and a lot of op-eds and discussion that a lot of the problems we're having with the internet they really kind of stem from targeted advertising. And I'll just give you a really simple kind of talk through example. Like if you subscribe to something like HBO Max or whatever they call it now, it's changed names a million times. You pay a monthly fee for a pretty high quality service. They don't care if you log in once a month or once a year or watch 12 hours a day. It doesn't matter. You're paying a monthly fee for a product that you deem worthy of your fee. There's no incentive for you to be addicted, right? HBO doesn't get more money if you watch 10 hours a day or if you watch 10 minutes a day. You just pay and you can use the product as much or as little as you want. But when you have things that are paid for by advertising, like all of social media and Google and all these things on the internet, there's this unfortunate perverse incentive to addict people. TikTok doesn't make the same amount of money if I spend 10 minutes or 10 hours like HBO or Netflix does. They make way more money if I spend 10 hours because I see a huge amount more ads. The longer I spend on these platforms, the more ads I see. And I guarantee this will be the case with AI and chatbots very soon. Elon Musk has already announced that Grok and the X AI chatbots are going to start incorporating ads, and I'm sure the others will. Absolutely guarantee. So the problem is then you will have the companies will have a financial incentive to addict you to their products. And this, I think we can all agree, is unhealthy because what addicts us, it's the same thing as with food, right? Junk food addicts us, sugar addicts us. A lot of things that are not good for us addict us, and it's just how human nature. So with the internet, political strife, a lot of hate, a lot of violence, a lot of things that are tearing society apart are addictive because you get angry, you get worked up, you want your team to win. So unfortunately, these things have a financial model where they make more money if we spend more time, and they figure out ways of getting us to spend more time, and it's a lot of it's not healthy. So the targeted ad tax idea is to not say, let's ban targeted advertising, because first of all, that's unlikely to ever happen. And second of all, if you did, then everything on the internet would cost money, right? Google would take a monthly fee. TikTok would be a monthly fee. Instagram would be a monthly fee. Everything would cost money. Even every news site would not be free, would be paywalled. And that would cause a lot of inequalities in society if, some people have more money for news than others. So we
It'd be
do
like
need,
the old days. It'd be like the old days
yeah,
before.
that's right. And
Yeah,
there's some good
where,
aspects to the old days
if you didn't pay
if they
for the
stayed cheap enough.
newspaper to show up at your door, you didn't get it.
Yeah, but that's before they were owned by like venture capitalists and
Yeah,
things.
okay. Yes,
But yeah,
continue.
but I agree. So it's the idea with the targeted ad tax is to just say, let's just tax revenue on targeted advertising. So companies can still have free services and do target advertising, but the government will get a bunch of money from that. Rather than these companies that are like, if you look at the list of the 10 wealthiest people in the world, the 10 richest, biggest companies in the world, they're all tech. Like 90% of them are tech. We need some way, and this is, sorry for being kind of socialist here, but Robinhood has a socialist flavor, right? So we need some way of distributing our resources more equitably in society. So just taxing target advertising revenue already would help get some revenue from these tremendous profits. But more than that, it would discourage that revenue source. So maybe OpenAI is trying to consider, should we fund the next version of ChatGPT with ads or should we do a subscription? Well, if the ads come with the tax and the subscription doesn't, they can, shift the balance or come up with things. So I think it's a really interesting idea. I don't think I want to go too much further into this now in the conversation, but there are some cool mathy principles that kind of talk about why this makes a lot of sense. I'll just mention one detail. You did say that it was a progressive tax. And when I first heard the word progressive tax, I should have known this, but I thought, oh, does that mean liberal? But no, progressive doesn't mean liberal. It just means well, maybe it does sometimes,
Yeah,
but it means it's
arguable, but
the
yeah.
rate increases as the scale or the size increases.
Yeah, so
And
like
that's a
income,
very mathy concept, and there's some mathy consequences that I think are interesting. So I'll just say the biggest punchline there is big companies like Google and Meta and all these, they would pay higher tax rates than the smaller companies because that's what progressive taxes mean. And just to be a little politically neutral, so as you can tell, I'm a little critical of big tech, but JD Vance has actually been very openly critical of big tech as well. He's not against tech. He just thinks it should be a lot easier for smaller tech companies to enter the market and compete. And I completely agree with him. And I think this idea of taxing the big dogs more than the small would get us some revenue from the advertising. It would make it easier for smaller competitors to enter. I think there's just so much that makes sense about it.
one thing that while we're on this sort of political thing, another thing there's a lot of political conversation about right now having to do with AI are the data centers and that are being built all over the place, and what's the future of that look like? And in reading your book, I was really shocked to read that the data at Kroger's, this is on the bottom of page 3 for readers.
It happens early.
Yeah, it happens early. The amount of data that Kroger's, the supermarket chain, has on its customers is more than the entire digital collection of the Library of Congress. Like, to me, that's shocking. For you, and I'm not focusing on AI or any of this anymore, but was there anything in writing the book? So I want to sort of step out and talk about some sort of your thinking about writing the book. Was there anything that really surprised or shocked you in doing research for the book?
I mean, one we touched on, but it's worth amplifying, is just that the math that was needed to discuss these topics, again, I'm not a financial person, and yet I think I could offer some lessons that are helpful. I'm not an insurance person, but I could kind of distill enough there. With social media, I felt like I had a better chance. But again, like I was surprised at I guess let me try to answer, how simple the math is that can help you in a wide range of topics. I was hoping that was the case when I started writing, but I was surprised at how true that was. It doesn't take much. There's literally no math in the book beyond addition, multiplication, subtraction, division. Nothing. I mean, you don't need the quadratic formula. You don't need anything, which is partly why I didn't go with images, because it's just so basic. So I was surprised at how far the simple math goes. The other thing we did kind of mention with the weighted sums is I was surprised at how often the same mathematical concept would rear its head in different settings. I chose the settings. I could have written the book by thinking of the math and then looking at applications, but I chose the real world settings for each chapter and then found the math within each. And I was surprised at how often the math that kept coming up was the same. Those are the biggest shocks, maybe to me as like a math professor. But the scale of the data certainly um, was shocking. And again, this is like pre-AI, or at least pre-generative
Right,
AI.
right, yeah.
So just to imagine where we're heading and where it's going next is, yeah.
So like I read into that answer that writing this book informed your teaching in
Hmm.
some ways and vice versa. So maybe like how did you decide to become a mathematician or maybe the professor part I'm more interested in right this second. And I don't know, like for me, I kind of knew I wanted to be a teacher and I had to choose my subject. But I know a lot of mathematicians are like, they're going to be a mathematician and then they are teaching, they're a professor. Which did you decide first? Was it, and how did that all happen?
All right. Well, yeah, I'm going to answer your question, but also push it and slightly,
Sure,
and
yeah,
also answer the question you almost asked, which is why do you decide to write this book, or how do you become an author? But it's related.
sure, okay, yeah, that's a good,
So
yeah, all that.
all of that. So I,
Yeah,
I have an
all that.
older brother. He's 3 years older, who is also a math professor.
Yeah.
And I would put in the gifted category. And he has always loved math and has always excelled in it. It's not to say he's never struggled. Like it's been hard and had to work, but I would say it's come more easily to him than to me. And when I was in college, my first year, freshman year, he kind of encouraged me to take these like honors math classes, just like he did his first year, and I was not ready for them. So I had a really hard time and was ready to bail on math and try other things. And he said, just stick it out. It gets, you'll get better at it. I said, it's not just better. Like I'm not enjoying it. I want to do something that's more interesting. And he said, it gets more interesting. Because at the time I was doing like honors calculus. And sorry to every calculus fan out there, but I still find calculus boring. So I
I
think
love
math is
calculus.
beautiful, but I think it does take some time to get there. So I hadn't gotten there yet. So he said, just stick it out. So I got to senior year and I liked it and I was good at it, but not great. Like never reached levels he reached in college. And at that point, you're a senior, you're graduating. It's a little bit late to do a new major. So I applied to grad school. Um, but even that was not a straightforward process. I thought, you know what? I'm not so sure about math. I think I'm gonna just like not go straight into grad school and explore some options and like kind of figure myself out. So I had already like signed up for the GREs and emailed my professors asking for rec letters. So I had to like sheepishly email my professor saying like, you know what, I decided it's not going to happen this year. Not going to apply. And one of my closest professors, he's a physics professor, but he was like a mentor for a while. He said, and pardon my language here, I hope there's not young people in the audience. I'll use the letter. He said, "What the F are you talking about? Just apply now, and in the spring you can see how you feel." And I couldn't, you know, it scared me, so I applied to grad school. And he was totally right because what happened was I got rejected from I forget actually all but one, literally all but one of my applications. But the one I got into seemed promising, and I went and visited because like you get a free trip, so why not visit? And you visit, and there's all these people, and they seem friendly, and like, hey, I want to be one of them. So then I came back, and it just seemed crazy to walk away from that and just find myself. It seemed like the way to find myself was to go hang out with these people and try grad school. So he was absolutely right. I felt so different in the spring after having applied than in the fall facing the like intimidation of applying. So I showed up the next year and made lots of friends, and it was a great experience, and I grew a lot. I went to college very close to home, so it's my first time. This is across the country, so like first time, being more independent, and crucially, first time out of my brother's shadow because he really like was a star math student at my college, and I was not. So everyone would meet me, and we have a very memorable, distinctive last name, so they would instantly know, like, oh, you're Jeff's brother, and then the expectations would be high, and they'd see my work, and they did not, it did not meet their expectations. So that was hard. Grad school, I could kind of find my own way. And it was similar to undergrad. I liked it, but I never quite loved it. And then enough years go by, and years go by and you graduate, and then what do you do? So I just kind of continued. And I just was always in this state of liking it, but never loving it. And I think I was probably biased by my brother who has just this innate passion for math. Like for him, it's not a job. He's one of these types who he would read math and write math papers even if nobody paid him. That's just like he breathes it. Whereas for
Mhm.
me, it feels like a job. Like I am so lucky to have this job. I love this job, but it's a job. I would not do it if they weren't paying me. But I was always looking for something I was passionate about because he had it and I didn't. And it just felt too late in life to like give up math and do something totally different. And I didn't know any other talents I might have. And during the pandemic, I just thought, you know what? I kind of feel like trying to write a book. And I knew nothing about it. And I've never been like a particularly talented writer or interested in writing, but I just really wanted to try. And I just found it really fun and interesting and learned a lot in that process. That was like 3 or 4 years before this one. Then when this one came out, I had a lot more of the understanding of the publishing process. So I got an agent, we got an editor, a publisher, the whole thing. And I just say I found my passion. Like I love writing, it turns out, but mathematics gives me something to write about. You know, I'm not going to write a memoir. I'm not going to write a history of George Washington. I get to
You never
write. I get to
know,
do
I
the thing.
guess.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll
Lincoln
see.
actually,
You
Lincoln
got
was
a
a
lot
big
of
fan of
years left
geometry.
in you. You
There
know,
are Alexander Hamilton did a lot of math. So there's,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
but
yeah.
anyway,
Like,
I did find what I was looking for all these years. And I love teaching, but writing feels like a way to take what I get from teaching. Like I love explaining ideas to people, especially in a, I'll be honest, I love the adversarial dynamic when I go into classroom and people are like, I'm taking this math class because I have to, I need a grade. I'm not like,
yeah,
this is going to be my unpleasant course, my broccoli, Brussels sprouts. I'm just getting through this.
yeah,
It's not like when you teach a really fun course that people take because they want to. I teach a lot of math that people have to take and they go in there with a mindset of like, this is going to be miserable.
yeah,
My favorite thing is getting those students to realize that was actually kind of fun.
yeah,
I have no interest, I hate to say it, in like teaching those math prodigies that are awesome and helping them get into grad school and do awesome things. Like, great, go on and do that. You would have done that without me. I love the students that think math is going to be a nightmare and they leave thinking that was actually fun. They're not going
yeah,
to be a mathematician, but they're not afraid of it anymore. So
yeah,
I feel like with writing, I get to do that, but on a larger scale than I could do in the classroom.
yeah,
Thousands of people instead of 20 people or 40
yeah.
people.
Yeah, on these presidents, like there's interesting presidents in math, right? There's one president, was it Garfield or one? I don't know.
Oh, this sounds
One of them
familiar.
had a proof of the Pythagorean theorem. I can't, or published a math paper.
Yeah, that's right.
And Lincoln in his second inaugural address uses an exponential model and talks about it. But anyways, that's really fascinating to hear your personal journey. I actually didn't know about your brother.
Oh, yeah.
Which you're probably like, whoa, how could that?
Finally, someone who didn't know about.
Yeah, no idea. When I meet him, I'll be like, oh, you're Noah's brother. Do you know Noah? Anyways, this kind of loops back to something at the very beginning, and when I mentioned that education is under attack in science. And I generally think that in the United States today, and here I sort of pontificating, a lot of people are like not really willing to think hard or think deeply or think about something new. And like your energy to write a book when you don't really think about yourself as an author or something is really refreshing to hear and wonderful to hear. And how do we get people to see the sort of gratification in challenging themselves mentally? And I don't mean with math necessarily. I mean with anything, with any kind of deep thinking. And that, I don't know if that's we don't have much time left. That's a big
Well,
question.
I think we have like 2 minutes. So let me just try to answer real quick.
Okay.
I think the most important thing is, maybe this is going to sound conspiratorial, is to recognize it's not the individuals that are at fault. It's not like, oh, people are not trusting science, that people are not stretching themselves and thinking hard enough. I hate to say it, but I really think there are institutional factors, there are larger economic, financial pressures that are pushing people, manipulating people into these directions.
Mhm.
So I think the answer is, education is a big part of it and being accessible. But I think we got to fight the powers that are telling people that they can't think for themselves, telling them that, these things that we're against. So I don't know if there's some podcasts that are making tons of money by getting people to question valid science and, causing a lot of harm. I don't blame the population for being gullible. I don't even necessarily, I mean, I do, but I don't even necessarily blame the podcaster always. I think the problem is they've figured out the algorithm, right? They figure out they can make a ton of money on Spotify by doing this, or a ton of money on Instagram or TikTok. And I think let's really take a broad systems view and say, we're in a system where people get rich by peddling misinformation and manipulating people. And you're never going to fix that system by just like, oh, if we take down Joe Rogan or whatever, that's going to, someone else is going to rise up immediately.
Yeah.
So we just have to figure out, how do we change the system? And of course, that's easy, very hard. But I just think that's where we have to come at it, is we have a system that's incentivized to make people fall into these traps of thinking, oh, I can't. And just to give like the TikTok example, to me, it's very frustrating to read articles in the New York Times and to hear like posts coming from TikTok itself that keep hyping up its algorithm for being this amazingly complicated thing. And then when I finally find a document that explains basically the algorithm, I'm just like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, I could teach first-year high school students this algorithm.
Right.
So I don't blame people for not knowing how TikTok works. I blame the larger system that's convinced people that they're not allowed to know how it works. But I think that applies to science as well. We've taken too many people out of that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, it's a great thing to end on, I think.
Okay.
It's not your fault. In other words, it's not your fault. It's nobody's
It's not your
fault.
Not much is really any one individual's fault.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Karen, I want to thank you for all your preparation for tonight and for double reading the book, maybe even triple reading it for all I know. Thank you so much. We appreciate your participation. We look forward to welcoming you at After Hours as well, to invite all of our guests watching tonight to come ask Noah specific questions about the algorithms that may be plaguing them specifically. His favorites, I want to know the hit list. Which ones are your favorite algorithms? Which ones do you?
None of them.
None of them. None of them.
I'm kidding.
I don't mind Waze. It helps me drive. I did
You can use Waze.
appreciate
I'll
Karen.
allow that.
I did appreciate kind of your heartfelt at the end. How can we get people to think deeply? Can we get it? I appreciate that. I feel that very much. I felt that as it came through. And I also want to comment, Noah, hearing also, as I'll echo what Karen said about your personal journey, I so appreciated your straightforward recitation of how you went from point A to point B, especially because you are obviously quite an accomplished person. The book is fabulous. It's quite thoughtful. There's so many great insights in it. And I always appreciate for the fan community when someone describes a professional and academic arc that is not some smooth kind of, and you can give a good word for the algebraic geometry of that, the smooth thing that looks like that, because no one or many don't have this thing. They have a thing and it's skewed lines in space, and then they went and bartended for 2 years, whatever.
You know what I find?
Kind of the reality,
It's always smooth when you look back. It's just never smooth when you're looking forward.
No, or not.
Not.
Less smooth. I appreciate the sibling piece too. Maybe your brother will come to After Hours. Let's see. I'll take my measure of him. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming. You can come to After Hours, come hang out with these two very nice people, make a donation to FAN, any dollar amount. We're not so picky. Come hang out with us. We're going to be there till 8:30. We're going to start at 8:03, which is in exactly 3 minutes. 27 more minutes with these two very sharp people. I want to find out about, there was a question submitted ahead of time, so you can ponder your answer for After Hours, which is, tell us the algorithm to get a middle schooler to understand that math is important at some point, even in that moment when they're like, how will I ever use this in the future? So help us figure out what can you help out some parents hoping for that for their kids. So everybody, thank you for coming tonight. We're going to have Caroline Fleck and Kelly Leonard from Second City on Wednesday. Come hang out with us. Thanks for your time tonight. Hope to see you at After Hours in just a few minutes. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tonight.